Hello friends, it's Gemma here, and today I have a little bit of a ramble to get off my chest. And that ramble is going to be on the subject of eclecticism and syncretism and being Wiccanesque. And that's a new word that I picked up recently when I read the book The Ethical Eclectic by Kaatryn MacMorgan-Douglas. And this book was recommended to me by Jessica on her Journeys of the Psyche channel. And this book is just basically about the ethics surrounding when you borrow things from various different paths and make them part of your own spiritual path for you as an individual. And it's a thin book, so it's not a very long read. It's kind of just, you know, a bit of an essay, and a long essay and a bit of a lecture about how you don't want to be acting like you're eating at a buffet and taking a little bit of everything from different spiritual paths and making it a part of your own without having any consideration as to whether or not you're respecting these paths and whether you're offending anybody who is following these paths intact and without changing them. So I picked up the word Wiccanesque, and it's just a word that means that your path is a little bit like Wicca, but it's not exactly Wicca in that defined structure that Wicca has. So when I read that book, I was like, yes, that's me, I'm Wiccanesque, because you know, there's a lot of things about Wicca that I really enjoy, and I actually highly respect Wicca, and I always have. It's a very disciplined path, and I feel that a lot of the people who walk that path and take it very seriously, whether they are your more modern eclectic Wiccans who learn their craft from reading books, or your traditional, either British traditional Wicca or other trad craft, I think that they're very disciplined and they're very diligent. I mean, they update their books of shadows regularly, and my book of shadows is a little bit neglected these days. In my early days when I was a young teenager, I was always writing in my book of shadows, like pretty much every day, and I would get out a lot of different books from the library. And I mean, I read the same stuff as everybody else. I read, you know, Ray Buckland's Big Blue Complete Book of Witchcraft. I read Scott Cunningham. I read Vivian Crowley, no relation to Aleister Crowley, but her book was Wicca, the Old Religion in the New Millennium. And I read Starhawk. I'm trying to think who else. Doreen Valiente. I read all of these kinds of books, and I loved it. I mean, when I first discovered the path of neo-paganism and the craft, and just to say how I define myself, the way that I define myself is as a pagan witch. So you could add on the prefix neo to pagan. It doesn't really bother me either way. I think it's just saying neo-pagan is a little bit of a distinction between the stuff that your ancient pagans used to do and what we do today. So obviously our path these days is quite different. We're not, you know, living in tribes and struggling for survival, and in our spare time going around making, like, hauling big stones and making these giant stone circles. We're not doing that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's just a distinction that you can make if you choose to. It doesn't really bother me one way or the other whether or not you do. But what I was saying is that I read all those same books as everyone else growing up, and I have borrowed quite a few things from Wicca that I use in my own path. For example, circle casting. I love circle casting. Circle casting is really where it's at for me. When I do that ritual of casting a circle, that is when I feel the most in tune with the gods. It's when I feel the most aligned with the universe and my own soul and who I am. And it's just, I love that beautiful feeling that you have of being in a circle where you're protected but not kind of, and you're kind of insulated but not cut off from nature. And it's just that divine channel that comes through. And yeah, anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I really love casting circle, and that's something that comes from Wicca. However, Wicca, you could say, is actually quite eclectic itself, because it borrowed from, you know, ceremonial magic and the Gnostics and the Zoroastrians and all those kinds of different faiths. And it was it did come about in the 1950s, so it's a relatively new tradition. However, it is an existing tradition that has survived today, and there are people who do practice that intact. So if you are borrowing from that, you need to respect those people who are practicing that intact. And I very much do, personally. And that's part of the reason why I don't use the term Wiccan to describe myself. It's not because I don't respect Wicca, it's because I respect them enough not to use that term to describe myself. And I am very much eclectic. I have moved on since those early days in my young teenage days, reading all those different books from the library on Wicca, and that was really kind of what was available at that time. To give you an idea, it was the late 90s, early 2000s. It was a really fun time to be a teenage witch, and that's what I was. I was a teenage witch around that time. And if you look at Thorne's channel, Drawing Canaz, she talks a lot about that as well, and she is actually a Gardnerian High Priestess. So if you want to check out her channel, I'll link it below. It's very interesting if you haven't looked at it already, and she's got a blog and everything, so I'll link her. But yeah, like, some people would say that eclectic Wicca is not real Wicca, and I think that's a tough call to make, because a lot of the people who are practicing Wicca, either solitary or as an individual and just kind of borrowing different things from the books that they've read on Wicca, they are in the majority. So it's quite a tough call to say that they don't have the right to use the word Wicca to describe themselves. And I think they do. I mean, it's close enough to Tradcraft Wicca and British traditional Wicca to describe it as Wicca, and I think that a lot of people who are on that path, not everyone obviously, but a lot of those people do take their path very seriously, and I think they have every right to use that word to describe themselves. And I myself moved on from that kind of eclectic book-learned Wicca onto, you know, a more just basic witchcraft path, and just like, I still cast circles, obviously I've talked about that, and the other thing I really like is that Wiccan 8-spoked Wheel of the Year, where you have the 8 Sabbats, and that's very much, well, I mean, the Wiccans adapted that from, you know, the ancient Celts and different civilizations like that that would celebrate these holidays, such as the equinoxes and the solstices, and then you cross quarter points. But I really enjoy that. I love it. And that's just something that I have brought into my path, even though I don't define it as a Wiccan path. It's eclectic neo-pagan or pagan witchcraft to me. And I've since read books by people like you know, Raven Digitalis, Christopher Penczak, and I believe Christopher Penczak does describe himself as Wicca, although Thorne has made the distinction that the stuff that you read about in, you know, Scott Cunningham books or Christopher Penczak books are not the same as British traditional Wicca. So that's very important to acknowledge. And what else did I want to say? Yeah. Just being eclectic gets a bad rap sometimes, and people kind of have this perception that you're sort of saying anything goes, and it's just whatever you say it is. Wicca is not whatever you say it is. I don't believe that. And are those people in the majority that are kind of trying to eat at a buffet and take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and not respecting the path? I think it's like a lot of things. It's just awareness. People are not aware that there are traditions that may be offended by the way that they're appropriating them. And however, there's a difference between appropriation and appreciation. And I was talking about this to my to the members of my tradition, the Idgaf tradition, how sometimes people, you know, they'll say, you know, there's this backlash against white girls doing yoga, and I'm not saying that white girls can't do yoga. I'm just saying be aware that it comes from a rich spiritual tradition that has been practiced intact for thousands of years, that people are still practicing intact to this day. And you know, there's this criticism of them saying namaste, and I think it's fine to say namaste if you know what it means. It doesn't just mean, it's not the same as aloha or konnichiwa. It doesn't mean both hello and goodbye. It means I recognize the light that's within you. It's the same light that's within me. We are divine and we are one. In a nutshell, I'm paraphrasing, but that's, if you understand that that's what that means, then you have every right to say that. And you know, more on the topic of cultural appreciation, there's a bit of a backlash against girls wearing bindis. If you buy a bindi that's actually been made by an Indian person and you adorn your third eye with it and you have that understanding that that's what you're doing, the Four Queens has talked about this before as well, but if you appreciate that culture that it comes from, and you're not sort of buying bindis that were made by white people for white people, and it's kind of bypassing them and what's the word, you know, just cutting them out of that whole transaction, that can be really damaging to their culture. So that's something to be aware of. And again, it's just awareness. And people will say things like, oh, you know, they criticize eclecticism because, you know, they're not respecting traditions. And sometimes that happens. Like, there are traditions that are closed, like your Native American, traditions, where, they use white sage to smudge, and people don't really understand the significance of that, and they don't ask any questions about where that sage comes from, and sometimes it can be quite harmful, both for the environment and for the people who are growing it. Sometimes it can be grown by people who aren't being paid properly and stuff like that. That's an issue that I've recently become aware of. So I don't buy white sage anymore. I make my own smudge sticks with, you know, my garden sage and stuff like that. So yeah, that's just something to be aware of. But again, it comes with raising awareness and just letting people know, because a lot of people just don't know. They're a little bit ignorant, sometimes by their own fault, sometimes not. But, you know, I think there are people out there who borrow things from other paths, and they do it in a very conscious and very respectful way. And, you know, I went to a workshop once on totem animals, and it was by a lady named Sunda Devi, and I'll see if I can link her website below if I can find it. But she does workshops on a lot of different things. I would have loved to have gone to one of her goddess or empowering women workshops, but she does work. She has spent time with a lot of natives, so she's spent time with both the Australian Aboriginals and the Native Americans over in America. And she's just learnt a lot from them, and she follows a very shamanistic path. So she was kind of sharing some of her knowledge just in this quick workshop that I went to one evening. So it was only a few, 4 hours or so. And one thing she said is that you can't use an abalone shell to put out your sage. That's wrong. And that just rubs me up the wrong way a little bit, because that may be the way that they do it in those traditions, but that's closed off to me anyway. Pardon me, that's a closed tradition and I can't be part of that. So do I have to stick to their rules about how to do things? I don't think I do. Pardon me. And I was speaking to this about my friend, to my friend Isis Blue, she goes by on the internet, so I'll just stick with that name. And Isis was saying that she's the same. She's very, it rubs her up the wrong way being told that something's the wrong way to do it, and she follows her own intuition and her own path. And for the most part, I think that that's okay to do. We're all individuals. We all have our own soul and our own preferences and our own, background. And our culture today is kind of a melting pot of all these different belief systems. And being eclectic has kind of just become a byproduct of that. So to criticize people because they're not sticking to any one tradition, I don't think that there's anything wrong with not sticking to any one tradition if you've tried it and you've found that it's not quite right for you. And I've got a quote here from the book The Mystical Kabbalah by Dion Fortune, and I will read it out to you. Pardon me. And it's the first part of the second chapter, the choice of path, and it's number 1 in that chapter. Pardon me, my throat's been terrible lately. But it goes, no student will ever make any progress in spiritual development who flits from system to system, first using some New Age thought affirmations, then some yoga breathing exercises and meditation postures, and following these by an attempt at the mystical methods of prayer. Each of these systems has its value, but that value can only be realized if the system is carried out in its entirety. They are the calisthenics of consciousness and aim at gradually developing the powers of the mind. The value does not lie in the prescribed exercises as ends in themselves, but in the powers that will be developed if they are persevered with. If we intend to take our occult studies seriously and make of them anything more than desultory light reading, we must choose our system and carry it out faithfully until we arrive, if not at its ultimate goal, at any rate at definite practical results and a permanent enhancement of consciousness. After this has been achieved, we may, not without advantage, experiment with the methods that have been developed upon other paths and build up an eclectic technique and philosophy therefrom. But the student who sets out to be an eclectic before he has made himself an expert will never be anything more than a dabbler. So that's a very provocative statement, right? That if you set out to be an eclectic, you'll never be anything more than a dabbler. Oh, a dabbler, we don't want to be a dabbler. So, you know, and I think it's really good for people to read something like that when they first start out, just so that they have that awareness that you have to stick to something and follow it through to get the benefits from it. If you're kind of just taking a little bit and eating at a buffet and not learning how those systems work that you are borrowing from and having respect for them, then it can really do you a disservice, and you can also offend people. You know, you can offend the people who are Wiccan or who are Hindu if you're borrowing their gods but not really learning about what that religion is all about, or if you're borrowing from yoga and going to yoga classes and you think that it's just exercise and you don't look into the spiritual philosophy behind that and the history of it, or, you know, if you borrow from Christianity. I mean, another thing I wanted to bring up is that people get very cranky about people calling themselves Christo-pagans, and up to a point in a lot of cases, I think that those people cop a lot of prejudice that they don't deserve, and I feel it needs to stop. However, you can kind of see how people would be cranky about someone calling themselves a Christo-pagan or a Christo-Wiccan when they feel that those two paths kind of contradict each other, and that the person is not following either of those religions in their entirety. And I think some people need to put a little bit of more thought into how they define their spirituality. I mean, if you're a Wiccan who has learned from books, do you need to use that label of Wiccan? Or can you call yourself, you know, an eclectic witch like I do? I'm Wiccanesque, but I'm an eclectic neo-pagan witch. That is how I define myself. Not because I don't respect Wicca, but because I do. And, you know, if you follow your favourite parts from Christianity and your favourite parts from Wicca, and you kind of blend them together, and you say, you publicly declare yourself as a Christo-pagan, you have to be a little bit prepared for backlash, because some people are going to be cranky about that. And I don't think it's right. I personally don't have any room in my mind for that kind of prejudice. If somebody wants to call them a Christo-pagan, it doesn't bother me, as long as they're not trying to convert me or, you know, anything like that. I honestly don't have a problem with it if someone wants to be a witch but they still want to go to church, or if they grew up and they had these prayers that became part of their soul and really spoke to them. Do they need to throw out the baby with the bathwater? No, I don't think so. So that's just my personal opinion, but you have to be aware and be conscious of the other people out there who are practicing those spiritual beliefs in their entirety as a complete system, even though you are not. And I do think that if you want to borrow from paths, then you need to educate yourself and be very well read and widely read and very learned on those kind of things. So yeah, I've kind of rambled, but I think I got across what I wanted to say. So I hope that you enjoyed this video and got something out of it. Please comment if you have something that you would like to discuss or any questions that you have for me. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye!